Pascal's wager is an argument in apologetic philosophy devised by the 17th-century French philosopher, mathematician and physicist Blaise Pascal. It posits that humans all bet with their lives either that God exists or not. Given the possibility that God actually does exist and assuming an infinite gain or loss associated with belief or unbelief in said God, a rational person should live as though God exists and seek to believe in God. If God does not actually exist, such a person will have only a finite loss. Pascal formulated the wager within a Christian framework. The wager was set out in section 233 of Pascal's posthumously published Pensées copyrights. These previously unpublished notes were assembled to form an incomplete treatise on Christian apologetics. Historically, Pascal's wager was groundbreaking because it charted new territory in probability theory, marked the first formal use of decision theory and anticipated future philosophies such as existentialism, pragmatism and voluntarism. The wager, the philosophy uses the following logic: God is, or he is not, a game is being played, where heads or tails will turn up. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions. You must wager. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation that he is. There is here an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss, and what you stake is finite. And so our proposition is of infinite force, when there is the finite to stake in a game where there are equal risks of gain and of loss, and the infinite to gain. But some cannot believe. They should then at least learn your inability to believe. And endeavor then to convince themselves. Pascal asks the reader to analyze the position of mankind, this crisis of existence and lack of complete understanding. While mankind can discern a great deal through reason, it is also hopelessly removed from knowing everything through it. He describes mankind as a finite being trapped within an incomprehensible infinity, thrust into being from non-being for a brief life only to go out again, with no explanation whatsoever of why, or what, or how. The finite nature of our being constrains reason with respect to every form of knowledge. Now, assuming that reason alone cannot determine whether or not God exists, the ontological question is reduced to a coin toss. However, making a choice to live as though God exists or does not exist is unavoidable even if the ontological question is inconclusive. In Pascal's assessment, participation in this wager is not optional because mankind is already thrust into existence. So even if God's existence cannot be independently confirmed or denied, nevertheless the wager is necessary and the possible scenarios must be considered and decided upon pragmatically. Explanation: the wager is described in Pensées copyright as this way. If there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since, having neither parts nor limits, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is or if he is. God is, or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions. Do not, then, reprove for error those who have made a choice. For you know nothing about it. No, but I blame them for having made, not this choice, but a choice. For again both he who chooses heads and he who chooses tails are equally at fault, they are both in the wrong. The true course is not to wager at all. Yes. But you must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good. And two things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. This is one point settled. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation that he is. That is very fine. Yes, I must wager. But I may perhaps wager too much. Let us see. Since there is an equal risk of gain and of loss, if you had only to gain 2 lives, instead of 1, you might still wager. But if there were 3 lives to gain, you would have to play, and you would be imprudent, when you are forced to play, not to chance your life to gain 3 at a game where there is an equal risk of loss and gain. But there is an eternity of life and happiness. And this being so, if there were an infinity of chances, of which one only would be for you, you would still be right in wagering 1 to win 2, and you would act stupidly, being obliged to play, by refusing to stake 1 life against 3 at a game in which out of an infinity of chances there is 1 for you, if there were an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain. But there is here an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss, and what you stake is finite. Pascal begins by painting a situation where both the existence and non-existence of God are impossible to prove by human reason. So, supposing that reason cannot determine the truth between the 2 options, one must wager by weighing the possible consequences. Pascal unregistered trademark S assumption is that, when it comes to making the decision, no one can refuse to participate. Withholding assent is impossible because we are already embarked, effectively living out the choice. We only have 2 things to stake, our reason, and our happiness. Pascal considers that if there is equal risk of loss and gain, then human reason is powerless to address the question of whether God exists. That being the case, then human reason can only decide the question according to possible resulting happiness of the decision, weighing the gain and loss in believing that God exists and likewise in believing that God does not exist. He points out that if a wager was between the equal chance of gaining 2 lifetimes of happiness and gaining nothing, then a person would be a fool to bet on the latter. The same would go if it was 3 lifetimes of happiness versus nothing. He then argues that it is simply unconscionable by comparison to bet against an eternal life of happiness for the possibility of gaining nothing. The wise decision is to wager that God exists, since if you gain all. If you lose nothing, meaning one can gain eternal life if God exists, but if not, one will be no worse off in death than if one had not believed. On the other hand, if you bet against God, win or lose, you either gain nothing or lose everything. You are either unavoidably annihilated or lose the opportunity of eternal happiness. In Note 194, speaking about those who live apathetically betting against God, he sums up by remarking, "It is to the glory of religion to have for enemies men so unreasonable." Inability to believe, Pascal addressed the difficulty that reason and rationality pose to genuine belief by proposing that acting as if one believed could cure one of unbelief. But at least learn your inability to believe, since reason brings you to this, and yet you cannot believe. Endeavor then to convince yourself, not by increase of proofs of God, but by the abatement of your passions. You would like to attain faith, and do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief, and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you, and who now stake all their possessions. These are people who know the way which you would follow, and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured. Follow the way by which they began. By acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe, and deaden your acuteness. Analysis with decision theory, the possibilities defined by Pascal's wager can be thought of as a decision under uncertainty with the values of the following decision matrix. Given these values, the option of living as if God exists dominates the option of living as if God does not exist, as long as one assumes a positive probability that God exists. In other words, the expected value gained by choosing B is greater than or equal to that of choosing B. In fact, according to decision theory, the only value that matters in the above matrix is the plus A. Any matrix of the following type results in as being the only rational decision. Criticism of Pascal's wager began in his own day, and came from both atheists, who question the benefits of a deity whose realm is beyond reason, and the religiously orthodox, who primarily take issue with the wager's and agnostic language. It is criticized for not proving God's existence, encouragement of false belief, and the problem of which religion and which God should be worshipped. Nature is not a proof of the existence of God. Voltaire, a generation after Pascal, rejected the idea that the wager was proof of God as indecent and childish, adding, "The interest I have to believe a thing is no proof that such a thing exists." Pascal, however, did not advance the wager as a proof of God's existence but rather as a necessary pragmatic decision which is impossible to avoid for any living person. He argued that abstaining from making a wager is not an option and that reason is incapable of divining the truth. Thus, a decision of whether or not to believe in the existence of God must be made by considering the consequences of each possibility. Honestly judged, however, Voltaire's critique concerns not the nature of the Pascalian wager as proof of God's existence, but the contention that the very belief Pascal tried to promote is not convincing. Voltaire hints at the fact that Pascal, as a Catholic Jansenist, believed that only a small, and already predestined, portion of humanity would eventually be saved by God. In this context, Voltaire explained that no matter how far someone is tempted with rewards in order to believe in Christian salvation, the result will be at best a faint belief. Pascal, in his Pensées, agrees with this, not stating that people can choose to believe, but rather that some can not believe. As Champsaurier explained, in order to accept Pascal's argument, the bettor needs to be certain that God seriously intends to honor the bet. He says that the wager assumes that God also accepts the bet, which is not proved. Pascal's bettor is here like the fool who, seeing a leaf floating on a river's waters and quivering at some point, for few seconds, between the two sides of a stone, says, "I bet $1,000,000 with Rothschild that it takes finally the left path." And, effectively, the leaf passed on the left side of the stone, but unfortunately for the fool Rothschild never said "I bet." Argument from inconsistent revelations. Since there have been many religions throughout history, and therefore many conceptions of God, some assert that all of them need to be factored into the wager, in an argument known as the argument from inconsistent revelations. This, its proponents argue, would lead to a high probability of believing in the wrong God, which, they claim, eliminates the mathematical advantage Pascal claimed with his wager. Denis Diderot, a contemporary of Voltaire, concisely expressed this opinion when asked about the wager, saying an imam could reason the same way. J. L. Mackie notes that the church within which alone salvation is to be found is not necessarily the Church of Rome, but perhaps that of the Anabaptists or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Muslim Sunnis or the worshippers of Kali or of Odin. Another version of this objection argues that for every religion that promulgates rules, there exists another religion that has rules of the opposite kind. If a certain action leads one closer to salvation in the former religion, it leads one further away from it in the latter. Therefore, the expected value of following a certain religion could be negative. Or, one could also argue that there are an infinite number of mutually exclusive religions, and that the probability of any one of them being true is zero. Therefore the expected value of following a certain religion is zero. Pascal considers this type of objection briefly in the notes compiled into the Pensées copywriters, and dismisses it as obviously wrong and disingenuous. This short but densely packed passage, which alludes to numerous themes discussed elsewhere in the Pensées copywriters, has given rise to many pages of scholarly analysis. Pascal says that unbelievers who rest content with the many religions objection are people whose skepticism has seduced them into a fatal repose. If they were really bent on knowing the truth, they would be persuaded to examine in detail whether Christianity is like any other religion, but they just cannot be bothered. Their objection might be sufficient were the subject concerned merely some question in philosophy, but not here, where everything is at stake. In a matter where they themselves, their eternity, their all are concerned, they can manage no better than a superficial reflection, and, thinking they have scored a point by asking a leading question, they go off to amuse themselves. As Pascal's scholars observe, Pascal regarded the many religions objection as a rhetorical ploy, a trap that he had no intention of falling into. If, however, any who raised it were sincere, they would want to examine the matter in detail. In that case, they could get some pointers by turning to his chapter on other religions. As David Wetzel notes, Pascal's treatment of the pagan religions is brisk. As far as Pascal is concerned, the demise of the pagan religions of antiquity speaks for itself. Those pagan religions which still exist in the New World, in India, and in Africa are not even worth a second glance. They are obviously the work of superstition and ignorance and have nothing in them which might interest lay gens Hubbard's Islam warrants more attention, being distinguished from paganism by its claim to be a revealed religion. Nevertheless, Pascal concludes that the religion founded by Muhammad can on several counts be shown to be devoid of divine authority, and that therefore, as a path to the knowledge of God, it is as much a dead end as paganism. Judaism, in view of its close links to Christianity, he deals with elsewhere. The many religions objection is taken more seriously by some later apologists of the wager, who argue that, of the rival options, only those awarding infinite happiness affect the wager's dominance. In the opinion of these apologists, finite, semi-blissful promises such as Kali's or Odin's therefore drop out of consideration. Also, the infinite bliss that the rival conception of God offers has to be mutually exclusive. If Christ's promise of bliss can be attained concurrently with Jehovah's and Allah's, there is no conflict in the decision matrix in the case where the cost of believing in the wrong conception of God is neutral, although this would be countered with an infinite cost in the case where not believing in the correct conception of God results in punishment. Furthermore, ecumenical interpretations of the wager argue that it could even be suggested that believing in a generic God, or a God by the wrong name, is acceptable so long as that conception of God has similar essential characteristics of the conception of God considered in Pascal's wager. Proponents of this line of reasoning suggest that either all of the conceptions of God or gods throughout history truly boil down to just a small set of genuine options, or that if Pascal's wager can simply bring a person to believe in generic theism it has done its job. Argument from inauthentic belief. Some critics argue that Pascal's wager, for those who cannot believe, suggests feigning belief to gain eternal reward. This would be dishonest and immoral. In addition, it is absurd to think that God, being just and omniscient, would not see through this deceptive strategy on the part of the believer, thus nullifying the benefits of the wager. Since these criticisms are concerned not with the validity of the wager itself, but with its possible aftermath, namely that a person who has been convinced of the overwhelming odds in favor of belief might still find himself unable to sincerely believe, they are tangential to the thrust of the wager. What such critics are objecting to is Pascal's subsequent advice to an unbeliever who, having concluded that the only rational way to wager is in favor of God's existence, points out, reasonably enough, that this by no means makes him a believer. This hypothetical unbeliever complains, "I am so made that I cannot believe. What would you have me do?" Pascal, far from suggesting that God can be deceived by outward show, says that God does not regard it at all, God looks only at what is inward. For a person who is already convinced of the odds of the wager but cannot seem to put his heart into the belief, he offers practical advice. Explicitly addressing the question of inability to believe, Pascal argues that if the wager is valid, the inability to believe is irrational, and therefore must be caused by feelings. Your inability to believe, because reason compels you to believe and yet you cannot, comes from your passions. This inability, therefore, can be overcome by diminishing these irrational sentiments, learn from those who were bound like you. Follow the way by which they began, that is by doing everything as if they believed, by taking holy water, by having masses said, etc. Naturally, even this will make you believe and will dull you. But this is what I'm afraid of. And why? What have you to lose? Whether or not one can genuinely choose to believe a particular story based on the appeal to possible consequences, is trivialized. The urgency Pascal expressed that one must choose, and quickly, is not convincingly an argument to choose at all. The wager requires a correct choice among two scenarios that are part of the religious story itself. One must choose first to be convinced in the dichotomy of two initial propositions, of what losing, or winning mean, as potential outcomes. While obedience and professing one's belief results in reward, skepticism or inability to believe result in punishment. Both of these propositions are foregone conclusions. The wager is based on these two assumed to be established conditions and their outcomes. From there, the gambler's choice degrades into a coercion on the basis of self-interest, swayed by an appeal to fear. The God in the scenario is Pascal's personal conception of how the Creator is or behaves, and so the wager is congruent with the jealous and angry God of the New Testament. Pascal's idea of God would include what is predictable behavior. He describes God's feelings as your primary concern, when stated plainly. What might upset him or not, will determine outcome. Pascal's wager is often compared to Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, where a subtle insertion of a foregone conclusion is presumed true and valid while the remaining propositions follow effortlessly. That which humans can capably conceive is an a priori announcement that humans can't conceive of much. Worse, Pascal goes beyond Anselm to claim personal knowledge of his God, and what that God expects, while presenting the appearance of a hypothetical scenario. Some other critics have objected to Pascal's wager on the grounds that he wrongly assumes what type of epistemic character God would likely value in his rational creatures if he existed. More specifically, Richard Carrier has objected by positing an alternative conception of God that prefers his creatures to be honest inquirers and disapproves of thoughtless or feigned belief. However, as noted above, nowhere in the establishment of the wager does Pascal appeal to feigned belief. God, being omniscient, would not succumb to such trickery and unwittingly reward the disingenuous. Rather, in the passage following the establishment of the wager, Pascal addresses a hypothetical person who has already weighed the rationality of believing in God through the wager and is convinced by it, but remains unable to sincerely believe. Again, as noted above, Pascal offers this person a way to escape the irrational sentiment that compels him to withhold belief in God after the validity of the wager has been rationally conceded. This way consists of applying oneself to spiritual discipline, study, and community. In practical terms, therefore, this alternative scenario of God valuing rational belief and honest inquiry which is offered by Carrier and other critics is actually not very different from Pascal's own formulation of the scenario. Indeed, Pascal is unabashed in his criticism of people who are apathetic about considering the issue of whether God exists. In note 194, he retorts, "This carelessness in a matter which concerns themselves, their eternity, their all, moves me more to anger than pity. It astonishes and shocks me. It is to me monstrous." Far from glorifying blind irrationality, one of the chief aims of Pascal's arguments in the Pensées copywriters was to shake people out of what he saw as their ignorant complacency so that they could rationally approach this most crucial existential matter. Pascal says in note 225, "Atheism shows strength of mind, but only to a certain degree. Unbelievers who persistently endeavor in an honest, rational effort to search for the truth are commended by Pascal, to the exclusion of those who are merely dismissive." Variations, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, was narrated as having said, "The astrologers and the physicians both said the dead will never be resurrected. I said, keep your counsel. If your idea is correct, I will come to no harm by my belief in the day of judgment, but if my belief is correct then you will be a sure loser by not believing in that day." Muhammad's descendant, renowned scholar and Shia Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, said, "If the matter is according to what they believe, and it is according to their belief, then they will be saved, while you will be ruined. And if the matter is according to what you believe, and it is not according to your belief, then you and they are equal." The sophist Protagoras had an agnostic position regarding the gods, but he nevertheless continued to worship the gods. This could be considered as an early version of the wager. In the famous tragedy of Euripides' Bacchae, Cadmos states an early version of Pascal's wager. It is noteworthy that at the end of the tragedy Dionysos, the god to whom Cadmos referred, appears and punishes him for thinking in this way. Euripides, quite clearly, considered and dismissed the wager in this tragedy. The Christian apologist Arnobius of Siga stated an early version of the argument in his book Against the Pagans. Pascal's wager is often concluded by stating that people should choose the safer wager. Pascal stated that people could not simply choose to believe, but that they might develop a faith through their actions. An instantiation of this argument, within the Islamic Kalam tradition, was discussed by Imam al-Haramayn al-Junai in his Kitab al-Irshad ila Qawati al-Adla fi Usul al-Itiqad, or A Guide to the Conclusive Proofs for the Principles of Belief. In the Sanskrit classic Zara Samakaya, Bariuchi makes a similar argument to Pascal's wager. See also, A Confession, Appeal to Consequences, Atheist's Wager, Christian Existential Apologetics, Decision Theory, Ecclesiastes, Existentialism, Game Theory, Pascal's Mugging, Pensées Copywriters, Notes. References, Al-Junai, Imam al-Haramayn. Dr. Paul E. Walker. A Guide to Conclusive Proofs for the Principles of Belief. Reading, UK, Garnet Publishing PPA 6/7. ISBN A1-85964-157-1. Leslie Armour, Infni Rien, Pascal's Wager and the Human Paradox, Carbondale, Southern Illinois University Press, 1993. James Cargyle, Pascal's Wager, in Contemporary Perspectives on Religious Epistemology, eds. R. Douglas Guyvett and Brendan Sweetman, Oxford University Press, 1992. Richard Dawkins, Pascal's Wager, in The God Delusion, Black Swan, 2007. Jeff Jordan, ed. Gambling on God, Lanham M.D., Rowman and Littlefield, 1994. Jeff Jordan, Pascal's Wager, Pragmatic Arguments and Belief in God, Oxford University Press, 2007, William G. LeCan and George N. Schlesinger, You Bet Your Life, Pascal's Wager Defended, in Contemporary Perspectives on Religious Epistemology, eds. R. Douglas Guyvett and Brendan Sweetman, Oxford University Press, 1992. Michael Martin, Atheism, Philadelphia, Temple University Press, 1990, Thomas V. Morris, Pascalian Wagering, in Contemporary Perspectives on Religious Epistemology, eds. R. Douglas Guyvett and Brendan Sweetman, Oxford University Press, 1992. Nicholas Riescher, Pascale Euro Unregistered Trademark S. Wager, A Study of Practical Reasoning in Philosophical Theology, University of Notre Dame Press, 1985. Jamie White, Crimes Against Logic, McGraw-Hill, 2004, Elizabeth Holowecki, Taxes and God, KPMG Press, 2008, external links to primary text, Pascal's Pensées Part 3 The Necessity of the Wager. The wager itself is found in number 233. Section 3 of Blaise Pascal's Pensées Copywriters, translated by W. F. Trotter, Project Gutenberg. The wager is found at note number 233. Other external links, standard references, Pascal's Wager in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Pascal's Wager and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, support. Pascal's Wager, Pragmatic Arguments and Belief in God by Jordan, Jeff, University of Delaware, 2006, Ambiguity, Pessimism, and Rational Religious Choice by Tigran Melkonian and Mark Pingle. Theory and Decision, 2010, Volume 69, Number 3, pages 417 to 438, Objections, The Empty Wager. By Sam Harris, The Rejection of Pascal's Wager by Paul Tobin, Pascal's Mugging by Nick Bostrom, Revisions, Theistic Belief and Religious Uncertainty by Jeffrey Jordan.